subpar acting, hack writing, and surprisingly good practical effects. Crap damn, a comic adaptation that you probably don't know about. No, stop! This isn't a fracking running joke. You don't get to just show up because we discussed something loosely related to Alan Moore. And stay out. Now, where was I? Yeah. If there's any DC character whose fame continues to confuse me, I'd have to say that it's Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing's a weird character because he has always been an obscure character, and despite this, he's had 2 full-length feature films, a cartoon series, and even a toy line. While a lot of people remember these things, a lot of them seem to forget that he even had a live-action TV show. This was a show that was on USA. Characters Welcome? And while the comic was mostly famous for its amazing run under Alan Moore, the movies were famous for, well, being really weird. I mean, the first one was Wes Craven's first real attempt at making a action movie, and for the most part it was a success. The sequel was awful and should never be spoken of ever again. The cartoon series, well, if you've seen any crappy 80s cartoons, you've probably seen this already, so skip it. But this show was a result of the 90s. Now, for those of you who didn't live through the 90s or were little kids and probably don't remember it, the weird thing about that era is that we could get TV shows made about anything. And I mean anything. And for some reason, comic book characters were really big. And even more confusingly, the USA Network wanted to do a TV show about Swamp Thing. And it's not like this thing was just some fluke that was only on for 1 season. This had 3 straight seasons. The premise of the show is pretty basic. A scientist named Alec Holland was in a horrible accident in the swamps, which turns him into a leafy muck man. Against him is the evil Dr. Arcane, who's a genius of great intellect, who releases his horrible creations into the wild for, science! Anyway, they duke it out in Louisiana. Or, well, I guess they kinda duke it out. They rarely actually come to blows. Mostly Arcane just tries a new experiment, and Swamp Thing shows up and then tries to expel some advice to all the kids watching. Lather, rinse, repeat. This went on for all 3 seasons of the show, and the only real thing that changed were the side characters. First season had Swamp Thing teamed up with a little kid by the name of Jim. Jim was probably the most annoying thing who you were ever going to meet. The weird thing about this kid was that they tried to establish that he was some type of problem child at the beginning, but they never follow up on that. Instead, he's just abnormally well behaved, incredibly annoying, played by a kid who can't act, and he ends up stealing most of the spotlight from Swamp Thing himself. In fact, a lot of the time, Swamp Thing's only function in the story is to either get caught because he's an idiot and have Jim save him, or to give Jim really bad life advice.
Only dumb kids dream.
The first season was bogged down by Jim. He's just such a problem, and because of that, they got rid of him the only humane way they could. By having him sold into human slavery in the season finale. Yikes! Did this really happen? Oh geez. Anyway, with the first season over, they tried to correct stuff and make it a little bit more true to the comic. And they didn't do so hot at that either. They started by introducing Abigail, who was supposed to be like Abby Arcane from the comics, but she ends up being more Daisy Duke wearing fan service than anything else. The real improvement that came in 2 forms. One, Swamp Thing got an older sidekick, Jim's half-brother by the name of Will. Will was a much easier to relate to character, but he was still pretty dumb. The big improvement was that Dr. Arcane got his own laboratory filled with a bunch of guys wearing goofy jumpsuits and his own sidekick, this guy named Graham, who is just a hoot. Mark Lindsay Chapman, who plays Arcane, always looks like he's having fun with the role, but once he had Graham to play off of, the show improved drastically. The second season had a lot of improvements, but it still had a lot of problems. It looked like old Abigail got fed up with being objectified, and, well, I can't really blame her. She got killed in the 3rd season. and the story tried to go in some other places. Will's part became smaller, and the stories got even more episodic, but pretty early on in the third season, it was pretty clear the writers were running out of ideas, which is mind-blowing to me. I mean, with a show like this, the ideas should just kind of keep coming, you'd think. But not with Swamp Thing. If you haven't figured it out from my earlier tone, this show was goofy as all get out. Most of it didn't work, but the things that did kind of made it fun. Mark Lindsay Chapman, like I said before, is fantastic as Arcane. And Dick Durock, who plays Swamp Thing, also does a great job. His makeup looks fantastic, and some of the practical effects look really good too. Some of them are even really scary. Unfortunately, most of the time it doesn't work at all, but when it does, it's really entertaining. I don't think that a review like this would be complete without telling you a couple episodes that you should check out. So here are a couple of my favorites. The first season is almost entirely terrible episodes, and most of them hilariously so. A couple that come to mind include Falco, where a falcon becomes a man, and Grotesquerie, where Jim is trying to save Swampy from a Dickensian sideshow owner who has taken Swamp Thing hostage after Swamp Thing poisons himself like a dumbass trying to open up a bottle of nuclear waste. I'm not even kidding. Jim is of course sent on his way in the shipment, which ends Season 1 and makes us enter Season 2, where we get another one of my favorites, The Watchers, where Abigail is pursued by Arcane's robot hillbillies. I shit you not. Oddly enough, Season 3 actually had legitimately good episodes. Better Angels, for example, comes to mind, wherein we actually have a love interest for Swamp Thing, who's a really interesting and kind of cool character. She helps him out in the episode Changes, where Swamp Thing almost turns back into a man, and there's some really great effects in this episode. This is preceded by an episode called Fear Itself, where Swamp Thing has to cope with the embodiment of fear and the possibility that he might have never been a man in the first place and that he might never turn into a human again. Something that was taken from Alan Moore's writing and was handled really well in this episode. Arcane even gets an episode that really stands out in here. An episode called Titania, in which he confronts his Davros-like boss, General Sunderland. Sunderland? Really? Come on. Who is apparently holding Arcane's previously thought comatose wife captive. This is a plot point that they didn't really explore enough, but this episode kind of makes up for it. Well, kind of. But if you're disappointed by all these good episodes, don't worry, there's plenty of bad ones to balance it out. Some that come to mind include one where Swamp Thing fights a guy to prove the evils of rock music. And the other great one is Swamp of Dreams, where Swamp Thing trips balls on hallucinogenic iguana eggs and even slaps an iguana for not laying enough eggs. Swamp Thing was a really weird show, and I'll admit, it was a show that I grew up on when I was a little kid. Watching it now as an adult, well, it's awful. But it's an awful experience that I think you should go out and have for yourself. You probably won't regret it, maybe not, actually you probably will. Check out the DVD release from Shout Factory. There's even some interesting interviews with Dick Durock talking about his work on the show, and it's a really great way to remember a really fantastic stuntman who died a couple years ago. From all of us here at Fifth Avenue Studios, I hope that you have some fun with some cheap and crappy TV shows from the 90s. Remember to keep on spockin' in the free world.
Wait, you call that a review?
Well, yeah, Plant Man, what are you gonna do about it? Give me some lousy advice again?
Oh, you will feel my wrath. White Lantern power!
Ah!